Fellow Ghanaians, a very good evening to all of you, and thank you very much for joining us here on Upfront on the Joy News channel. Well, it's Wednesday, the 27th day of July 2022, a day when Parliament has been lots of controversies, lots of issues about the printing of some 22 billion Ghana cedis by the Bank of Ghana. Well, the minority in Parliament insists that the Bank of Ghana printed this amount of money for the government. They say that is clearly illegal. But as you do know, the Bank of Ghana has issued a statement, and even in Parliament, the majority say that cannot be the case. But also in Parliament, lots of controversy surrounding whether or not Sarah Adwoa should maintain her seat as Member of Parliament for Dom Kwabenya or her seat be declared vacant. The information we're picking indicates that members of Parliament from the minority side on the Privileges Committee, they also have their own reports. They will be presenting a minority report because the majority says, well, she must vacate her seat. We've been doing some bit of speaking with the minority, and they tell us, can you sanction a man when you have not heard from that man? What happened to the laws of natural justice? Why don't we hear from Sarah Adwoa before a decision can be taken on whether or not she should be a Member of Parliament for Dom Kwabenya or her seat be declared vacant? The majority says, well, we gave her all the opportunity, we gave her all the chance, she never showed up. And so let the constitutional provisions be implemented and let the ruling by the Court of Appeal, when Kweku Asari took the case to court, which says if you, absent yourself from more than 15 sittings, you automatically lose your seat. It's still going on in Parliament. We'll be finding out what's happening in Parliament, and we'll share that with you even as the show goes on Upfront on the Joy News channel. But tonight our focus is on corruption. So I'm sure you've heard of the Afro Barometer, where it says after the police, the presidency office of the president is the most corrupt institution in Ghana. It doesn't end there. It actually goes to talk about Parliament. So right after the executive, then you get to Parliament, where it says that people believe that about 54% of Ghanaians believe that most or all members of Parliament are corrupt, with some 42 believing that some members of Parliament are corrupt. What would you make of that figure? In effect, over 90% of Ghanaians believe that at least some members of Parliament are corrupt. Now, this is the institution that we expect to hold the executive accountable. This is the institution that has oversight, as the control of the public purse. So if this institution is perceived as being corrupt, what does it itself mean for our democracy? But even before we get into what it means for our democracy, already some persons have started asking questions. They've said, well, how did they come by this percentage? What was the sample size? Is it representative of the Ghanaian population? This is perception. And so why would we want to go with a survey based on perception when the government statistician and Shraj recently conducted one that's totally different from what we see in the Afro Barometer? My name is Winston Amoah, and tonight on Upfront, we focus on these key issues. We ask that simple question, do you trust the Ghanaian policymaker? Do you trust him to take or make the right decisions on your behalf? Or, like many Ghanaians are beginning to tell us, they see them as corrupt. But even if, as we talk about corruption, how did we measure corruption? What do we believe is corruption or corruption entails? Tonight, we're joined by a senior research fellow of CDD, Dr. John Osai-Kwapong. He'll be helping us understand the methodology. He would help us understand also some of the key questions that have come up. We'll also be joined by Dr. Rashid Rahman, who's Executive Director of the Africa Center for Parliamentary Affairs. They're both joining us to have this all-important conversation. And as always, you can also join us. You can join us on Twitter and tweet at us on the Joy News on TV, Joy News TV, and tell us what your thoughts are, and we'll share it with the rest of the world. When we return after these messages, we begin deliberations, starting with Dr. Osai Kwapo. Right, so welcome back, and thank you very much for staying with us here on Upfront on the Joy News channel. Let me start off with you, Dr. John Osai Kwapo. Thank you very much for joining us. We believe you're doing very well.
Yes, I'm doing very well. Good evening, and thanks for having me.
Great. So let's get into everything. I mean, we'll get into the findings and all, but already a lot of questions are being asked about the methodology. How did we come by this? The 2,400 Ghanaians that we sampled, how did we come by them? And can we say this is representative of the Ghanaian population?
Yes, so Afrobarometer uses a nationally representative sample. Every adult 18 and above has an independent and equal chance of being selected. Respondents are also selected randomly across the regions, and in setting up the sampling, Afrobarometer makes sure that it mirrors as closely as possible the distribution across the regions, and also mirrors distribution in terms of the national population, proportioning in terms of urban, rural, gender. So the sample size is 2,400. Anytime there's research and the issues of sampling, there's always that conversation about, if you have a population of 30 million people, do the views of 2,400 people represent the views of them. But I think in research methodology, we always know that there is no way you can speak to an entire population. That is why there are appropriate ways of selecting a representative sample to at least gauge the sentiment of your broader population, plus or minus within a certain amount of error, or what I call a little bit of noise in the data.
How did you select that representative sample?
So it's random. So they establish the sampling frame, and then across all of the regions in the enumeration areas, there's a listing of the households from which the particular respondents are selected. If you look at the breakdown from the report, if you look at the breakdown region by region, for example, and you compare it to the share in the census, you would see that the sample size per region mirrors very closely the share of the population in the most recent census. You would also notice that when the respondents are being selected from each of the households, what Afrobarometer does is it uses an alternating random selection, meaning if the first respondent is a male and the next randomly selected respondent is also a male, it alternates and makes sure that the next randomly selected respondent is a female. So if you look at the survey, you would notice that it breaks down 50-50 male-female, right? Now, one of the questions that came up earlier on today in one of the conversations on a different show on Joy was that the urban-rural population doesn't mirror very closely the general census. In Afrobarometer, it was 60-40, but in the most recent census, your urban population is about 57+%, around 58. But then what they do then is that in the analysis of the data, the responses are weighted. So the weighting corrects for any of the sort of differences that you might see in the actual population versus in the sample population.
So I mean, having established that, one of the things I just want us to establish before we get into the details itself is corruption in itself, because that's what has really generated a lot of the controversy. So how did we define corruption? And so when you ask people which institutions are most corrupt, how are we defining corruption?
So the question says, how many of the individuals associated with these institutions do you believe are involved in corruption? And then your response choices are none of them, some of them, most of them, all of them. You also have a choice of don't know, and you can also refuse to respond to the question. So on the institutions, that is the way the question is framed. The other corruption question that deals with the fight against corruption frames the question as how well or how badly do you think the government is handling fighting corruption in government? And again, the response choices are very badly, fairly well, very well. And then you can also answer don't know. You can also refuse to answer. So that's how the corruption questions are defined in Afrobarometer.
Great. So we realize, for instance, that you have the police, and the police has been number one for some time now. You have Office of the President, then members of Parliament come in there. And that's got a lot of people talking. But even as people talk, there's one other issue they raise, which we'll come to shortly. But first, let me get your take on members of Parliament, because you've been asking Ghanaians, the expectations of a hanged Parliament and how they expected this hanged Parliament to hold the executive in check. What does the perception that over 90% of members of Parliament are engaged in some form of corruption mean in Parliament holding the executive accountable?
Right. So, it would be always great if in surveys you can also ask exactly what is informing perceptions. But I also say that for a survey like Afrobarometer, you know that citizens' responses are informed by their lived experiences or the lived experiences of others that they've heard, stories they see, narratives that they hear in our public space. And so when you have that high level of perception, for example, of an institution like Parliament that is designed to have oversight responsibility of the executive, and you juxtapose that against how citizens have evaluated the effectiveness or otherwise of a hanged Parliament, you do see that the expectations or the reviews of the hanged Parliament is somewhat mixed. In some instances, they believed that it has strengthened to some extent the oversight of the executive in terms of how money is spent. But then it's much lower when it comes to the question of it's allowed the parties to cooperate and work together. But I think the bigger point on the question of corruption, if you look at the listing in terms of the order, that it becomes quite worrying that your key institutions on which democratic governance depends are being perceived by the citizens as being corrupt. And then if you also look at the ratings on trust, that also doesn't bode well for democratic institutions. I think it's very worrying in a democratic polity when your citizens perceive your critical institutions as not being trustworthy and also perceiving them as not or as being corrupt. And I think it's overall quite worrying then to have citizens feeling the way they feel about our key democratic institutions.
Yeah, now, while that could be worrying, the other school of thought is that it's a perception.
Right.
And so, yes, it's a perception, it could be worrying, but that may not even be the case, right?
Right. Yes. But, the interesting thing is, so if you look at the GSS Shraj survey, yes, I know in that particular survey, for example, the Office of the Presidency or members of Parliament didn't feature in that.
Yeah.
But at least you also do get a sense of what citizens are reporting in terms of their actual contact with public institutions, public officials, and the extent to which they are or are not paying bribes. So you can you can triangulate all of these data sources and realize that Afrobarometer is documenting perceptions. Another survey is documenting the actual incidence of bribery. A couple of years ago, there was a very good survey by the Ghana Integrity Initiative that also reinforces this concern about public corruption within our public institutions. So whether it's perception, whether it's the actual incidences of corruption and bribery, at least the picture that is emerging is that we do have a serious challenge of corruption in our public institutions and in our institutions that are designed to make our democracy work.
Okay, I'll get back to you on, because a lot of people have raised issues about, the SHRAJ and Ghana Statistical Service, report or research, because that actually looked at those who have paid bribes before. And in that particular one, the Office of the President didn't feature. But let me get to Dr. Rashid Draman, who's Executive Director of the Africa Center for Parliamentary Affairs, and get his take on this issue. Because there you have it. We anticipated, or we probably may have expected, that a hung parliament was what Ghana really needed, because then you're going to have the executive in check. The evidence doesn't seem to suggest so, because people see Ghanaian MPs as corrupt. What do you make of the Afrobarometer survey, Dr. Rashid Draman? If you can kindly unmute your microphone so we can hear you.
Yes, Winston, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes, it's very worrying, particularly when you have the three key arms of government, because we have the presidency, we have parliament, and then we have the judiciary, all at the top of this perception survey. But it makes all of us worried. But now let me come to the issue of the hung parliament.
Sure.
The expectation of everyone was that a hung parliament was going to be very good for accountability, very good for transparency, and overall very good for our democracy. What might be happening in this perception survey is that perhaps maybe in this case the stakes are very, very high, and there has been effort maybe at all times whenever perhaps there are bills and documents before Parliament to try and co-opt whoever can be co-opted. If you remember, during the vetting of the ministerial nominees, the first set, I think the base of the NDC was very, very angry with their members who were on the committee.
Sure.
About the fact that they raised a lot of issues about a number of ministerial nominees, yet when it came to counting the numbers, we saw that almost all the ministers were passed.
All of them were passed.
People began raising questions and so on. I don't know exactly what happened, and I don't know what people know. And I'm sure all these contributed to fueling some perception about the fact that maybe there might have been some underhand dealings, there might have been some exchanges of favors one way or the other in order to get some of these things done. The fellow from CDD, you put a question to him about the fact that this is a perception and it might not be the case. It's very interesting because anytime the Transparency International, for instance, releases its CPI, whenever our country does well or countries do well, they praise the perception index. And when they don't do well, then they are all up in arms. And really, I think whenever there is this perception, I think behind it, there is some reality. So that is the way our citizens feel about our members of parliament. And that's the way they feel about the presidency. That's the way they feel about other arms of government, as well as other institutions. And if you look at, I believe there is some correlation between this Afrobarometer survey and what we saw last week with
Shraj and the Ghana Statistical Service.
Shraj and Ghana Statistical Service report. So for me, I think rather than being very defensive, and I'm sure members of parliament are going to be very defensive.
Well, they are actually defensive. I've been speaking to some members of parliament. Well, you know, parliament is in the last days. They are rising tomorrow. So they're unable to join us on the show, also because they're going to be laying, you know, the report of the Privileges Committee on, you know, absentee members of parliament. And that's generated a lot of controversy. But what they tell me is, how did you come by this? And I'll be getting to, you know, Dr. Osai Kwapong shortly. The question is, how did they come by this? Did anybody come and say they've given us money? Or, I mean, they expected us to give them money, or we gave somebody money, and that's why they say we are corrupt? How did they come by that?
Well, I mean, rather than being defensive, look, I think they should look themselves in the mirror and try to see what is it that can be done to correct this integrity challenge that is before them. I mean, many parliaments ago, we had Honorable Apio Ofuri come out and say during the Vodafone transaction to say his colleagues and everybody in the house was given an envelope. And year in, year out, we hear some of these rumors. So rather than being defensive, I think really they have a lot of work to do in terms of trying to ask themselves very difficult questions. Even if this is not true, what is fueling this perception on the part of the people that they represent? What is it that they can do in order to change this perception and rescue the image of what is a very important institution that we all look up to hold everybody in the Republic to account and to ensure transparency and accountability?
Are you disappointed that the institution expected to ensure accountability is often seen as the institution that condones corruption in this country?
Yes, I'm very disappointed. And you see, if you perhaps maybe put our situation, the current report, maybe you put it in a kind of a global perspective. I used to have friends at the World Bank who used to do all these surveys around the world. And one day, one of them told me that in some advanced countries, I think members of parliament are only better than car salesmen when it comes to the perception of not speaking the truth and being corrupt and so on. That's how citizens in other places compare members of parliament. And so I am not surprised about this, particularly given all the previous stories that we have heard in years past. And again, like I'm saying, for me, rather than members putting up a defense, members trying to put up a denial, I think they should rather ask themselves a very tough questions.
What are those hard questions you want them to ask them, your members of parliament to ask themselves?
Well, I think I want them to ask themselves the question, why is it that the people who elected us to represent them are the same people now who are saying they don't trust us, are the same people who are saying we are corrupt? And then the follow-up question for them is that what is responsible for some of the high turnover rates that we see after every election? I think these are very serious questions that they need to really reflect on and try and see how can they change their image. They need an image remake, and how can that happen? What is it that they can do? If this is not true, I think they have a lot of work to do in order to correct this wrong perception. If it is true, they even have a much harder work to do.
Let me find out your own view. Do you think that parliament is corrupt? Members of parliament are corrupt?
Well, I don't have any evidence, and Afrobarometer did not. I was not part of those who were surveyed, so I don't have any evidence. I was not surveyed.
Do you perceive them to be corrupt?
Well, I don't perceive them to be corrupt. I work very closely with them. I hear stories about they being corrupt, but I don't have any evidence.
You've heard Alban Sumana Kingsford Bagbin, for instance, say that.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I've heard stories.
Yes, you've heard him say. You've heard members of Parliament, during in 2017 during the vetting of then Energy Minister designate. Some members came out to say that he had been giving bribes of some monies, thousands of cedis, to approve him.
Yes, indeed. And like I was saying, even Honorable Appeal Furi came out many years ago and said, I was in Parliament then working with them and said, we were given envelopes. So all these stories have been around with us for some time. And that is why I think really, rather than put up a defense, I think they should eat humble pie and try and see what is it that can be done. Maybe they need to hire some image consultants that can work with them and remake their image so that we can see them, the citizenry can see them in some good light, rather than this negative light from which we see them year in, year out.
Okay, I'll get back to you, George, but let me get to Dr. Osei Kwapong. And Dr. Osei Kwapong.
Winston, I have to go because, as I said, I'm running into a meeting.
Okay. Let me get to, thank you. Let me get to Dr. Osei Kwapong. Now, Dr. Osei Kwapong, let me just find this out from you. Now, last week we read the report by the government statistician and Shraj, and in there we saw a different picture. For many of these members of parliament, they say the Afrobarometer cannot be representative because the people who say they have paid bribes, when they were sampled, 15,000 of them, Ghana's MPs were not in there. So,
can you repeat your question again? Because I lost you for a little bit.
Okay, so I was asking the question that, the government statistician and Shraj, now they conducted a research on corruption, bribery. And they came out that out of the 15,000 people that they interviewed, they said, you look at how much had been paid, you're looking at an estimated 5 billion Ghana cedis. In there, like you didn't see the presidency office of the president, you didn't see members of parliament, but we see them here featuring prominently. Now, members of parliament in particular say, well, this is a clear indication that we can't trust the Afrobarometer survey, because if people who had paid bribes, people who had given monies, didn't mention us, what's the need of a perception?
Right, but in the GSS Shraj survey, the presidency, parliament were not listed as part of the institutions because, their approach was first they ask, did you have contact with any of these institutions? And then they come up with a contact rate. And then they also then subsequently ask, if you had contact with them, did you pay any bribe? And then they calculate the bribery rate. And then they ask, if you did pay a bribe, how much bribe did you pay? The presidency and parliament were not listed as part of the institutions that they catalogued in that report. The thing about Afrobarometer is that they've been doing this for 9 rounds, beginning in 1999 at intervals. And one of the questions that I would ask, for example, I would ask the institution of the presidency to reflect upon is this. Not too long ago in round 2, 2002, only 11% of Ghanaians were perceiving the presidency as being corrupt. What has happened over the last couple of rounds and years that now that we are in 2022, that perception is as high as 50-something%. I'll ask the same question of parliament, right? There was a time at which the perception of corruption among the institution of parliament wasn't so high. And now here we are that it's around 54%. So for me, instead of being dismissive, my attitude and my approach would be, what is the point of reflection? What kind of signal are citizens sending to us? What is it that we are doing or not doing that is fueling this belief and this perception among citizens that all or most of us are involved in acts of corruption. And for me, that becomes the point of reflection that is very critical for these institutions and how citizens are feeling about them.
What do you think could be the reason? Let me just find out from you. What do you think could be the reason why people perceive these two major institutions of our governance system as corrupt?
I'm sure it's the stories you and I hear, the stories that either some of them may end up telling or not telling. Probably is the stories that people around them, share with friends and, family, as some of the exposés that we see in the media that is reported on, even though they may be acts of alleged, corruption. Some of them may be even yet to be proven. It is, the frequency with which we are seeing some of these stories that I believe is fueling that perception, right? And then now, particularly because we live in a democracy where there is improved access to information and reporting by the media, we tend to read a lot more about stories of alleged corruption in the newspapers. We hear it on radio, on TV. We see it on social media, right? We see the Auditor General's report that lists a whole lot of infractions and money lost, to financial improprieties in terms of practices within our MMDA. So I think all of those things contribute to fuel that perception. And the question is, if that perception is according to these institutional leaders, if these perceptions are not close to reality, then it behoves upon them to show a different disposition that helps us change why we are feeling and believing the things that we are feeling and believing about them.
Now, let's stay with Parliament, for instance. If these are not close to reality, do you see Parliament giving the impression or indication that whatever we've heard in the past is not the case? When you watch the dealings of Parliament, when you listen to the conversation out of Parliament, do you see an institution that is clearly giving the signal that this is not who we are?
Yes, when some of these stories come up. So I remember there was an allegation once about some envelopes having changed hands during the vetting of a particular nominee, right? They had an open hearing in which there was, the denials, it didn't happen. I think when some of these stories emerge, right, that these forceful denials and being very transparent about it, I think helps quell some of that perceptions that you have. I always say that there are two ways of dealing with perceptions of corruption and allegations of corruption. There's the legal way of dealing with it, which really takes time, and how many citizens actually follow legal proceedings when someone is charged with corruption. But then there's also the political way of dealing with allegations of corruption. So how forcefully do you come out to condemn the allegations while still recognizing that there is a legal process to follow? Are there some actions that you can take politically? Because whatever institution you're part of, if allegations of corruption come up, ultimately it is that institution whose image gets tarnished, right? So if someone in the office of the president gets accused of corruption, ultimately it tarnishes the reputation of the president and that institution. So you also have to find political ways of saying, fine, I want to presume the person innocent, but at the same time, maybe can I ask them to step aside for a little bit? Are there things that we can do to manage the political fallout? And I think sometimes on the political side, enough of that is not done. And so when you don't do enough of that, it reinforces this notion that perhaps it's something that's going on and everybody's in it and it's acceptable, and it may not be so.
But talking about enough not being done with the political aspect, look, we had the allegations of bribery of the appointments committee. A committee was set up to look into it. They came out with their report, said nothing of a sort happened. You had the cash for seats, a committee was established. But even there were disagreements. So is the political approach in itself the best way? Because out there, according to the public, the feeling, the belief is that this is all a cover-up.
And, as you said, and even in the political arena where you have the two competing narratives, right? One side saying, yes, it was true, it happened. Another side says, I didn't hear it, it didn't happen. All of that doesn't help. But if you can find those sort of dispassionate conversations, openness about it, then it can at least help to quash some of the feelings and beliefs that citizens have. But if they see inconsistencies in the narratives, in the stories, if the explanations don't sit very well with them, they may just walk away saying, well, if you say it didn't happen, well, then so be it. But then at a certain point, when you get to ask them about what do you think is going on with these institutions, these are the responses that you're going to get.
Yeah, but you'd say it didn't happen, but because you have two competing sides, so the question really is the polarized nature of our politics, or the partisan nature of our parliament and our politics, the reason why we have these perceived corruptions?
Yes and no, right? Yes, partisanship can cloud our perceptions, can cloud the way we feel about issues. But beyond that, and yes, the partisanship makes the conversation sometimes very difficult, and how we deal with it very difficult as well. But when you wade through the partisanship, in fact, if you look at previous Afrobarometer surveys and you break it down by political affiliation, I did a book on the Kufuor years, and in 2005, when some of those perceptions changed, even people who said they were affiliated with his party had some of those changing perceptions about how well the fight was going. Yes, it rebounded by 2008. So even in the midst of the partisanship, people can look beyond that and be able to, arrive at some of these perceptions. And again, I go back to my basic question. There was a point in time where the perceptions of corruption in these institutions was very low. How come now it's on the rise to the point where 5 out of 10 citizens perceive the presidency and parliament as being corrupt? And that, for me, is the food for thought for these institutions.
Before we go with you, let's look at the presidency briefly. Let's look at the presidency, because yes, the presidency has not been performing well for some time now. But particularly for a presidency that promised to fight corruption, a presidency that touts its achievement in resourcing the Auditor General, passing the Office of Special Prosecutor Act, and doing a lot of things in anti-corruption. Are you surprised at this outcome?
Yes, and also because if you look at Afrobarometer round 7 in 2017, the president scored very well in terms of how he was handling the fight against corruption. 60% approved the way he was fighting corruption, only to see that number dwindle so low in 2022. You have the Office of the Special Prosecutor. And so you start asking yourself, what is it that is fueling this sudden change in perception when it comes to the presidency, particularly against the backdrop of some of the moves that the presidency has made? I think sometimes people actually want to see more punishment. Maybe that convinces them that we are fighting corruption very well. But the president also said something very instructive a while ago, which was, not until you're in trouble, you don't appreciate due process, which is very true. But if you left the fight of corruption to just the legal process, it may, because and legal processes take a long time, it may at some point appear that you are not doing anything about the fight against corruption, which is why I keep saying, are there things that you can also do politically to demonstrate to citizens that you are fighting corruption beyond just setting up legal frameworks?
Yeah, but you can't fire. Dr. Osei, you can't fire a minister, for instance, when he hasn't gone through the process. So if he goes through the process, and at the end of the process, he's seen not to have done anything wrong, wouldn't you have done enough to show that you're actually fighting corruption?
But a legal process that can take about 3-4 years, right? But by the time that legal process is over, the political fallout that you would have suffered in the eyes of the public would have already been suffered. So you would have to find a balance, right? My concern is that if you leave everything solely to the legal process, which I strongly believe in, you leave yourself vulnerable to the political process as well, because the political process moves much faster than the legal process. And so you must show, and when I talk about the political process, sometimes it's even about expression of disappointment that even such an allegation would come up, right? And still end up saying, whilst I'm disappointed, I wait to see what the legal process would say. Sometimes if the allegation is very egregious, you can actually ask you are the appointing authority. You can ask the person to step aside, because ultimately it becomes a reflection on you.
But that would also go against you. Before we wrap it up here, with you, that could also go against you. Now, you have an opposition party that would say this is an indication that indeed you did this. So, how do you explain that?
Right, but you see, if you also don't take any action, it fuels the opposition's narrative that you are either condoning, you're clearing people, you're defending them. Probably if you also were quick to take some action, they might say, well, why don't you wait for due process, things like that. So again, for me, that is where leadership must walk that fine balance between the legal and the political. Because again, you also want to safeguard the reputation of the institution. And sometimes waiting for the legal process to fully play out may not do it for the institution.
Well, waiting for the legal process to play out may not do it for the institution, but the political process also creates the doubts in the system. So for many people, the real question I want to get an answer to, before we go with you, is that in 2017, the president was doing well. Office of the president was doing well. What has changed? Do you know?
It's the same question I'm also asking. What has changed? Is it because more, the reporting is, there's more reporting on alleged acts of corruption? It's a question that I think we have to keep probing, because at this point, I really don't have answers. I just have more questions. I just keep asking myself since yesterday, after this public release, is why are we seeing this radical shift in perception for the West when it comes to this particular administration?
Did the resignation of Martin Amidu and all the things he said in any way undo all the good things about the establishment of the Office of the Special Prosecutor?
I think it contributed. I believe that it has. When you have such high-profile figures who were charged with fighting corruption, writing such epistles, I'm sure it does go some way to also shape, public opinion. Because this was a person who was charged with fighting corruption as a special prosecutor and ends up describing the administration and the president in some very strong language. I think that can contribute into informing how people perceive the institution of the presidency.
But that notwithstanding, the current special prosecutor is doing well, isn't he?
Yes. And that's what we expect the special prosecutor to do, right? We expect that allegations of corruption will be taken seriously. And hopefully, when we see more action from the special prosecutor, that hopefully the next time around when we ask about the fight against corruption, it would look better.
Finally, when it comes to Parliament, there's a hung Parliament. Lots of issues drag in Parliament. And for many Ghanaians, once the issues drag over a long period, and then Parliament comes to a consensus, it means something has given. Do you think that the more issues drag in Parliament, the more the perception of corruption increases? Two, would you say that the control that political parties have on Parliament, and in some instances you've had the main opposition party, its own executive taking members of Parliament on, is fueled this perception about corruption of members of Parliament?
I think the more things prolong, I don't think I personally would look at it as an issue of corruption. Especially we have a hung Parliament, right? So the numbers become critically important. Both parties will duke it out. And it will take a long time sometimes for, and that's democracy, right? We need compromises. A compromise doesn't necessarily mean that something untoward happened, right? It just means that after a long, protracted fight, we were able to find some common ground. Sometimes we may not be able to find common ground, and one side, by even a one-vote majority, may end up prevailing. So I wouldn't say that, prolonged fights over legislation or policy issues in Parliament should be the reason why, at some point, when there's a compromise solution, we should view that as something untoward happened and therefore fuel perceptions of corruption.
Well, but in Ghana, the perception is that once it drags, then lots of negotiations are going on. And again, it's a perception. So once it drags, the negotiations are ongoing. Eventually, a decision is reached. And a decision is reached because we have negotiated more. And in negotiating better in Ghana, the perception once again is that some monies have changed hands.
But not always. And so if that is, and again, if that becomes the speculation, then the burden is on the institution to try and quell that speculation. Because again, a compromise and a negotiated settlement doesn't necessarily mean that something untoward happened, right? If Parliament were not this close, then the majority would never have to compromise, would never have to negotiate with anyone. They would always have their way. But I think the composition of this particular Parliament, yes, sometimes it gets acrimonious and very contentious, but I think for me, my belief is that it should even force more compromises and more negotiations because of how close it is. But I don't think negotiation necessarily means that something untoward happened.
Well, Dr. John Osei-Kwapong, thank you very much for joining us this evening as a Senior Research Fellow of CDD Ghana. We're very grateful that you made time to join us.
Thank you for having me.
Great. This is Upfront on the Joy News Channel. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Right, so welcome back, and thank you very much for staying with us here on Upfront on the Joy News Channel. And while we're talking about issues to do with corruption, well, I've just seen a statement from the Ghana Police Service, and they're asking further questions. I'll just share with you some of the questions they're asking, because the police is asking, for instance, that they would want to know why other institutions like the Ghana Ports and Harbours Authority, Ghana Civil Aviation Authority, Audit Service, Parliamentary Service, Ghana National Fire Service, public media houses, NAPCO, NADMO, and other institutions were not part of the options available in SHRAJ and the Ghana Statistical Service research. They say, in concluding, for instance, that there's also the real risk that your research may have been affected by a historically pervasive stereotyping of the police service. The service has almost now become the default institution of choice for such research and has therefore encouraged a deep-seated public stereotype over the years. The stereotype may easily influence respondent choices and is therefore fair to expect that you factor it in assessing the validity of your findings. It is a statement signed by the IGP, George Akufu-Dampare. That's all from us this evening on Upfront on the Joy News channel. My name is Winston. I'm on behalf of the team. Thank you very much for joining us. Join us same time tomorrow in the evening. But first, you can join me on the Super Morning Show on Joy 99.7 FM. Have a lovely evening.